I care not today what tomorrow may bring, if shadow or sunshine or rain. The Lord I know ruleth o'er everything, and all of my worry is vain. Living by faith, in Jesus above, trusting and Number 281. Number 281. Let's read the song before we do it. you bow with me, please? Our Father, we're thankful for this Lord's Day that we have, that we can come with our prayers and supplications, sing songs of praise to you, and have a listen. Father, I ask that you would be with our sick, whether in the hospital or recovering at home or shut-ins also. Father, I ask that you would be with our leaders in our country. Father, also ease the people's mind in California that's dealing with the fires. Father, we're thankful for the Francis family and their new addition. I ask that you would bless them and bless that young'un. Father, we're also thankful for Isabel. She's decided to put Christ on in baptism. From time to time, she'll probably need help and understanding. We pray that this congregation gives it to her and that she always follows in your footsteps. Father, we're thankful for this day and our Lord who died on the cross that we could have remission of our sins. Father, I ask this prayer today in his name, Jesus Christ. Amen.
I'd like to mark number 590 for after the lesson, number 590. And before the lesson, number 444. And if you're able, let's be standing, please. I once was lost in sin, but Jesus took me in, and lit a little light from heaven filled my soul. I paid my heart in love and wrote my name above, and just a little talk with Jesus made me whole. Now let us talk with Jesus, let us tell all about our troubles. He will hear our faintest cry, and he will answer by and by. When you feel yearning and your heart is hurting, you will find a little talk with Jesus makes it right. Sometimes my path seems drear without a ray of cheer, and then a cloud is down me out the light of day. The mist of sin may rise, and I'm in starry skies, but just a little talk with Jesus clears the way. Now let us have a little talk with Jesus. Let us tell him all about our troubles. He will hear our faintest cry, and he will answer by and by. When you feel a prayerful yearning as your heart in heaven is turning, you will find a little talk with Jesus makes it right. I may have doubts and fears, my eyes be filled with tears, but Jesus, a friend who watches day and night. I go to him in prayer, he knows my every care, and just a little talk with Jesus makes it right.
Good morning. There are some parts of Scripture that are weightier than others and deserve more of our attention and are of greater significance than other parts of Scripture. And Jesus made this very thing known to the scribes and the Pharisees in Matthew 23:23, when he said, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe mint and dill and cumin, but have neglected the weightier provisions of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness." He says, these are the things you should have done without neglecting the others. So all of God's commands are important, and none of them should be neglected, but there are some commands that are weightier than others. They're more significant, deserve more of our attention. I want to start a series of sermons starting today through the section of Scripture that is extremely weighty, and we find it in Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5. We know it as the Ten Commandments. So this is basically like a lesson to serve as an introduction to the Ten Commandments, and then we'll deal with each commandment in a separate sermon as we go through. You know, in our country, there was the Ten Commandments on all kinds of official buildings and government buildings, and a lot of people worked really hard to take those down, and many of them have been taken down. They didn't want the Ten Commandments on their buildings and them. And I think a lot of times in the Lord's church, we didn't seem that it would be that big of a deal to remove the Ten Commandments because, after all, we're not under the old law. But let's study this and look at it. I want to start by giving you some reasons why the Ten Commandments were so important to Israel. The first thing is, these commands that we receive, that Israel received, this is the only time that I know of anywhere in the Bible where God audibly spoke to a multitude of people. And so Moses leads the people out of Egypt and through the Red Sea and then through the wilderness until they get to Mount Sinai. And then God, he has Moses tell the people that the God who delivered them and who had been protecting them and guiding them through this land wants to make a covenant with them. That this God who brought you here wants to make a deal with you. And the deal was that God would take care of them and continue to bless them, and they would be God's special people out of all the people on the earth. God would protect them from their enemies and provide for everything they needed, and that they would keep His commandments that He was going to give them. And of course the people said, now this sounds really good. Let's make this deal with God, and we'll get all these blessings and protection and provisions, and we'll definitely keep all of His commandments. So they wanted to enter into this deal, and so Moses had to prepare the people for this meeting with God. You see this in Exodus chapter 19. They were given a couple of days to get themselves cleaned up physically and spiritually to the best of their ability. And so they got prepared, and then on the third day, of course, they were to meet with God. There were boundaries that had been set up around Mount Sinai so nobody could get too close to try to catch a glimpse of God, and they would end up dying. So there was boundary markers set up, and then on the morning of the third day, it says God came down on Mount Sinai. Look at this with me in Exodus 19, the scene that you see when the nation is gathered there before God. Beginning in verse 16, it says, "It came about on the third day, when it was morning, that there were thunder and lightning flashes, and a thick cloud upon the mountain, and a very loud trumpet sound, so that all the people who were in the camp trembled. And Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. Now Mount Sinai was all in smoke, because the Lord descended upon it in fire, and its smoke ascended like the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mountain quaked violently. When the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses spoke to God, and God answered him with thunder. The Lord came down on Mount Sinai." And so this is a terrifying scene where the people are following Moses out of their camps, which was near the mountain, up to the foot of this mountain to meet with God. God has come down to meet with them to establish this covenant, this deal that they've agreed to enter into with God. And so the people are trembling with fear. They're terrified as they're standing there listening and seeing everything that is going on. This would be a terrifying scene, no doubt about it. And then God audibly spoke to the entire nation from the top of this mountain. He begins by introducing himself. He introduces himself in Exodus 20 and verse 2. He says, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. God is saying that I am the one who's responsible for those 10 plagues that you saw in Egypt. I'm the one responsible for getting you out of there, out from under the oppression of the Egyptians. I'm the one who led you with the pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night. It was me who parted the Red Sea for you and destroyed your enemies when I closed it. I'm the one who's been giving you the manna that you wake up to every morning and gather for 6 days and twice on the 6th day, so you'll have some for the 7th day. It's me who's split the rock and gave you the water. I'm the one who's taking care of you, protecting you from your enemies, providing for you and leading you. That's me. I'm your God. And so God speaks to the people, continuing with these commandments. And he goes on talking about, you shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol, and so on and so forth, all through the rest of the 10 Commandments. And what happens at the end of this, when God finishes giving them the 10 Commandments, the people are so terrified, it was so terrifying, they probably thought they were about to have a heart attack. And they begged that Moses be the one to speak to them for God, that God no longer speak to them directly. They couldn't handle it. You see this in verse 18, Exodus 20. All the people perceived the thunder and the lightning flashes and the sound of the trumpet and the mountain smoking. And when the people saw it, they trembled and stood at a distance. Then they said to Moses, speak to us yourself, and we will listen. But let not God speak to us, or we will die. Moses said to the people, do not be afraid, for God has come in order to test you, in order that the fear of him may remain with you, so that you may not sin. So the people stood at a distance while Moses approached the thick cloud where God was. And so you can see clearly, God gives them these 10 commandments, speaking directly, and they say, please, let not God speak to us anymore. And so God then used Moses for the rest of what he was going to speak to the people. But these initial 10 things that he brought forth, he spoke them himself. Now let me give you some reasons why these were so important. Another indication, not only that God spoke them audibly himself, but their importance is emphasized because they were engraved on stone tablets. These stone tablets were made twice. You remember, because the first time when Moses came down from the mountain after having been given the 10 commandments on stone tablets, he was carrying them. He gets to the bottom of the mountain. This isn't long after the people made this agreement to be in a covenant with God and not to have any other gods. And yet, just as soon as he comes down the mountain, he finds them worshiping an idol. The very beginning of the commandment that God gave. And they've established this idol. So Moses is angry. He throws down the tablets. They shatter. And then God sets up an opportunity for him to come back up. He says, Moses, carve out your own stone tablets and bring them up, and I'll inscribe on them. And so Moses gets the stone tablets, goes up early in the morning, and God gives him another set, and he brings them down. Another indication of the importance of the 10 Commandments is those tablets were kept in the most sacred place anywhere upon the earth, in the Ark of the Covenant. You remember that holy box they built? You couldn't even touch it. Had you touched it, we know what happened to Uzzah. When he tried to steady it, he was struck down by God. Joshua didn't know, or David didn't know what to do at the time. He just decided to leave the ark alone for a while. And it rested there with the gentleman until David learned better how to carry the ark with poles, not on an ox cart. And so these tablets were kept inside the Ark of the Covenant. The rest of the commands that God gave through Moses were written down on scrolls, and they were kept beside the Ark of the Covenant. But these were written on stone tablets, and they were kept inside. the Ark of the Covenant. The Ten Commandments appear to be a summary of all the laws that God had given them. God gave them 613 laws in the Law of Moses. But most of those 613 are just elaborating in detail on the original 10. Or if you broke one of the original 10, there was a series of laws about how you were to go about your situation from there. And so the 10 summed up the rest. Matthew 22:40, Jesus said, "On these two commandments hang the whole law and the prophets." Let me give you an outline for the 10 commandments. You may know about this outline, but the first four are the first part of the 10 commandments. And those first four have to do with your honoring and responsibilities toward God. And so you have no other gods, no images even to represent God. He says, no vain use of my name, and observe the Sabbath day and keep it holy. Those four have to do with your relationship vertically with God. But then the next 6 had to do with the way that you would honor and your responsibilities with your fellow man or your neighbor. And they went, honor your father and your mother. He said, thou shalt not murder, don't commit adultery, don't steal, don't bear false witness, and no coveting what belongs to your neighbor. And by the way, coveting is one of those things that sort of lead you to the rest, doesn't it? Because if you covet something that your neighbor has, you may be tempted to bear false witness that you might obtain it. You may be tempted to steal what they have. If it's their spouse, you may be tempted to commit adultery to obtain what they have. You may just want to murder them in order to get their vineyard, Naboth, right? So that coveting what somebody else has can lead to a bunch of the rest of these. But I want you to think about it like this. The fourth commandment, which is to observe the Sabbath day and keep it holy, you might see it as a bridge between the beginning part of the 10 commandments and the end, where you're not only honoring God, but also you're honoring your neighbor. And that fourth commandment sort of bridges that, because on that Sabbath day, you didn't just honor God, you were also honoring your fellow man. You were there with them, in communion with them. You were to give your family and your servants the day off so that they could have time to worship and honor God. So it sort of kind of combines both sides of the 10 commandments, if you will. And how we relate to God and honor God is really first and primary, isn't it? So the 10 commandments are in the right order because the beginning of them have to do with your honor toward God. And that's got to be the first and most important thing. When Jesus was asked, what is the greatest commandment? You remember what he said? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. The second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. And it seems to me that most people don't realize this. If you were to ask the common people today, what constitutes being a good man or a good woman? Most people would probably say, well, you be honest, you're trustworthy, you're kind to other people, you're good to other people, you know, you don't hurt anybody. But actually, that's secondary. And they overlook the fact that the most important of all God's ethics has to do with your connection and relationship to God. Because if you get that right, everything else will fall into place. Because you will be honoring and glorifying God and wanting to maintain a relationship with God, which is going to have to do with how you treat other people. But if you think that just being good to other people and being kind and being honest and being generous and being all these things, but you neglect to have a relationship with God, it's all for naught. And it may be fictitious at best. But we have to have and maintain a relationship with God first and foremost. And so these are some reasons why we would say the 10 Commandments were extremely important to Israel. You can see that. Let me give you a second point. Secondly, you can see why the 10 Commandments are not important to us today. Why wouldn't the 10 Commandments be extremely important to us today as they were maybe to Israel? Well, they're not so important to us today as they were to Israel because we're not under the law that God gave to the nation of Israel. We're under a new covenant. And so whenever you find commands in the Bible, you've got to ask yourself, who are these commands written to? Who are these commands given to, and is this applicable to me? So, for instance, Noah, God commanded Noah, he commanded him to build a giant ship, a giant boat. You know, you're not to be building a giant ship today. That command isn't for you. In fact, if you do go out to build a giant ship, you're actually misusing your time, because that's not what God has commanded you to do. Noah was commanded to build a giant ship, and guess what occupied just about all of his time? Building the giant ship, carrying out the command. Paul was commanded to go and preach to the Gentiles. Guess what occupied just about almost all of Paul's time? Going and preaching to the Gentiles. So we've got to find out, what has God commanded us, and then is my time being used appropriately in order to be absolved in and immersed in carrying that out, whatever that might be, so that I might please God, find my name in the hall of faith, as it were. But we're not commanded to build a giant ship. God commanded Hosea to marry a prostitute. That was for Hosea. Boys, that's not what you're looking for, okay? Stay away from there. The 10 Commandments were given to the nation of Israel. And this is part of the covenant, the deal that God was making with them. These 10 commandments that he audibly spoke. And many of the 613 commands that he gave were only temporary. They had a temporary purpose. They were for those customs in ancient times, and some of the things that they were involved with. They were to keep them designated and separate from those pagan nations around them, and they were to lay down the foundation work, which would be the fulfillment when Christ came. And so those animal sacrifices that you see all throughout the Old Testament, God was going to bring his lamb, the Lamb of God, and make his sacrifice for the sins of men and women. So the law is not binding on people of other nations during that time. You didn't see that. And so you wanted to be under the law, you had to become a proselyte. So if somebody who wasn't a Jew, they could be under the law of Moses if they proselyted, which would require the males to be circumcised. They'd have to agree to the covenant and all the commands that God had given them, and they would basically become like a Jew. They would be now under the law that God gave to the Jews. But there are certain things that were sinful for a Jew to do that were not sinful for a Gentile to do, because they were under the law that God had given them. So eating pork, if you were a Jew and you went out and ate pork, you'd be sinning. But if you were a Gentile, you could eat as much pork as you want, and you weren't sinning. Observing the Sabbath day, if you were a Jew, you had to observe the Sabbath day. If you didn't, you'd be sinning. If you were a Gentile, you weren't obligated to observe the Sabbath day. You wouldn't be sinning. What about the Passover festival? That feast, that was required for Jews, but not for Gentiles. And many of these commands were sinful to the Jews and the Gentiles. And it's not because the Gentiles were under the law that God gave to the Jews. Things like no murder, no adultery, no stealing, these are universally applicable to every person in every generation. And so Gentiles sin when they do those things. If a Gentile murdered somebody, even though they're not under the law that God gave to the Jews, they were still sinning. And in fact, you read about this in Romans chapter 2. There are some laws that God gave on stone tablets and some that were written on scrolls, and there are other laws that are universally applicable that God writes on the hearts of every person. He writes them on our hearts so that they're known to be wrong by everybody, everywhere, in every culture, at all times. And you see this in Romans chapter 2, where he says here in verse 14 and 15, when Gentiles who do not have the law do instinctively the things of the law, these, not having the law, are a law to themselves. How is that? In that they show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience bearing witness and their thoughts alternately accusing or else defending them. Even though they didn't have God's laws written down, there were some laws that had been written in their hearts. Laws that are written in the heart of every man. That murder is always wrong, no matter where you live. Stealing is always wrong. Adultery is always wrong. And it doesn't matter if you're a Jew, a Gentile, an Israelite, or an American citizen. It's always wrong. But when you're in a relationship with Christ, you're a born-again believer, you are either a Jew or a Gentile, you're not under the law of Moses in the Old Testament. And so there's a whole bunch of passages we could look at. We're not for the sake of time in our New Testament that basically make that point. It was a huge point of contention in the first century. And you remember in Acts chapter 15, they came together from all over and they met and had a big conference there in Jerusalem. And the discussion that they wanted to have was whether or not people who were obeying the gospel had to be circumcised and continue to observe the law of Moses in order to be right with God. And Paul wrote in several New Testament letters combating this very issue. Churches that had Jews and Gentiles in them for the sake of unity and helping them to understand, not to make the law a point of contention. You're told over and over and over throughout the New Testament that you are no longer under that law. It's not binding, and in order to be in Christ, you would have to let go of the law. To continue to try to observe the law and bind the law, you'd have to keep it perfectly, which would become a curse because no one can. And you see this brought out in Romans chapter 7, just one example here, where Paul makes this point. He says here, "Or do you not know, brethren, for I am speaking to those who know the law, that the law has jurisdiction over a person as long as he lives. For the married woman is bound by law to her husband while he is living. But if her husband dies, she is released from the law concerning the husband. So then, if while her husband is living, she is joined to another man, she shall be called an adulteress. But if her husband dies, she is free from the law, so that she is not an adulteress, though she is joined to another man." And so this has application to the Old Covenant and the New Covenant, and how you can be freed from the Old Covenant and joined to a new covenant in Christ. And he goes on in verse 4 and explains it. "Therefore, my brethren, you also were made to die to the law through the body of Christ, so that you might be joined to another, to him who was raised from the dead, in order that we might bear fruit for God. For while we were in the flesh, the sinful passions which were aroused by the law were at work in the members of our body to bear fruit for death. But now we've been released from the law, having died to that by which we were bound, so that we serve in newness of the Spirit, not in oldness of the letter." And so they were basically Jews still under the law until they died to the law, which they did when they were, chapter 6, buried with Christ into his death. They then died to the law. The law, therefore, had no more jurisdiction over them, and they were then joined to Christ, entering a different and new covenant, which was a better one, Hebrews teaches. So this is some interesting points about why we would say the new covenant that we're under renders the Ten Commandments to be not important as they were to Israel. We're not under the old law. But lastly, the Ten Commandments are important to us today. Why is that? Why would we say the Ten Commandments are important to us today? I thought we're not under the old law of Moses anymore. Well, we're not. The reason they're important to us today is because Jesus has reinstated 9 of the 10 in the New Testament. That's why. And so 9 of these 10 we're still under because they are in the new covenant. He's transferred them into the new as well. And the one that he's not reinstated was the 4th command, to remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. And I would say that command, although we're not obligated to keep the Sabbath day, we're not under that command, there are some principles connected to that command that we'd be well to observe even today. And so 9 out of the 10 are relevant to every nation, every culture, every generation. But that 4th command is not for us today. Nowhere in the New Covenant do we read that we are to observe the Sabbath day and keep it holy, which is the 7th day. That's what the Jews did. They would get together on Saturday and have their solemn assemblies on that day. We meet on the first day of the week, and that is the pattern we see instated by the New Covenant and in the early church and the apostles' doctrine. Now, there are also important to us today because they're not for restricting our freedoms. You know, the new covenant gives us some laws. 9 of the 10 are still with us of the 10 commandments. Did you know the 10 commandments are not to restrict your fun? They're not to take away your enjoyment of life, your fulfillment, your satisfaction. That's not why God gave them. But sadly, how many people think of the Ten Commandments as if they're just to sap all the joy out of your life? They're to restrict you from everything that you ever really wanted to do. And they're going to keep you from having any kind of... Why didn't God just save time and say, listen, not any fun ever? That's how some people view the Ten Commandments. You know that? But that's what Satan has always done. He's always tried to convince men and women about God's commands, that they're very restrictive, and there's actually something beyond those commands that if you wanted to really have some fun and really have some enjoyment and really have your eyes open to some wisdom, you've got to go into this territory that God has forbidden. He's keeping something from you. That's what he did in the Garden of Eden, isn't it? With Eve, what did Satan say? Has God really said that you shall not eat from any tree of the garden? Oh, you surely will not die. Because, in the day that you eat of this, your eyes are going to be open to good and evil. You're going to be just like God. Sounds all too good to be true, doesn't it? And it was. No punishment and nothing but great things are coming? Wow, this really sounds wonderful. God's been keeping something from me. And he's put these commands on me because he doesn't want me to have a great life. This fulfillment and enjoyment that I'm missing. Why would he tell me, thou shalt not do this? God's holding back. When Israel got those 10 commandments, they had just been freed from their oppression in Egypt by God. When we get our new covenant laws from God, you realize we've just been freed from the domain of darkness, being under the power of Satan. He's transferred us out of that position, out of Satan's control and Satan's domain. He transfers us into the kingdom of his beloved Son. We're now in his Son's kingdom. We're children of light. He's given us a new name. He's given us a new life and a new spirit. And we've been given the opportunity to be his children and to walk through this life. Nobody can snatch us out of God's hand. We can continue to learn his word and be faithful. And he promises he's going to bring us all the way through to eternity into a heavenly home. He's promised all of that. He doesn't ask for perfection, but he asks for diligent efforts and faithful commitments. He wants us to continue pursuing him, looking his way, repenting when we sin, being heartfelt about when we mess up. That's what he wants from us. God has given us commands because he wants to give us the blessed life. It's interesting to me that we oftentimes let people in this world dictate what God's commands are, and we end up falling into the same trap thinking, man, that is kind of burdensome, isn't it? He says his commands are not burdensome. And in fact, we need to start viewing God's commands the way God views them, not the way Satan tries to make us view them. They're not there to restrict all your fun. In fact, God knows that his commands are to protect you from all of these heartaches and these guilt and all of the death that would come upon you. If you start breaking God's commands, you're going to have guilt, you're going to have regret, you're going to have pain, you're going to have all these situations that bring more frustration in your life, more stress in your life, more problems with relationships with other people in your life. When you keep God's commands, you don't have all that. You have more happiness, you have more joy, you have more peace. God created us and he created this world and he created everything about the situation we're in, and he knows perfectly how best to give us the most abundant life. He knows how it works. And so his commands are to make sure you have this blessed life, peace and joy and happiness and fulfillment and contentment, and just really able to trust him as you go through life. He's made it with his commands. But when we don't trust those, we think violating those is really where my satisfaction is going to be. We find out that Satan has actually lied to us. And there's no satisfaction there. There's sorrow there. There's despair. There's guilt. There's regret. It's just nothing but a misery that you could have avoided if you just kept God's commands. If you've had children, you likely know that you've had to lay down some laws, right? You can't just say whatever goes. You lay down laws for them. I remember when I was younger, my parents would say, son, me and my brother, we'd go outside. They'd say, you guys can play in the front yard or the backyard or on the side of the house or in the driveway. Even on the sidewalk, you can ride your bikes. But you must never, ever go into the street. Stay out of the road. Don't go out there. And they would tell me we'd go camping. I always wanted to get a stick and put it in the fire until it caught fire real good, and then I wanted to pull it out and start whipping it around, and my parents would say, Stephen, you're not playing with fire. Don't play with it. I mean, one wrong move, that thing goes into a bush, and, there goes the campground. So they didn't want me playing with fire. Well, I thought they were trying to take my fun away. I wanted to have some fun. Or they would say, don't go with strangers. Don't trust just anybody and just go off with them. Why did my parents give me those rules? Were they trying to take the fun out of my life? No, they were trying to keep me from dying. They were trying to keep me from pain and from problems. They cared for me, and so they gave me rules that would protect me. And God does the same thing for us. That's what His commands are. When we view them properly, then we will be more apt to want to obey them because we realize He's given them to us for our own good. And He knows best, and so we can trust Him. Even though that temptation is there and says, man, if you violate this, it's going to feel so good, it's going to be so great. Yeah, but my Father said, don't do that. And I trust that He gave me that command for a reason. Or He told me to be doing this. I need to make sure I'm doing that because I trust Him. And so we truly put our trust in God when we begin obeying Him. God designated this world, and He designated our lives, and He knows best, and we can trust that He was looking out for our best interests. How many times in the Old Testament do you read again and again God was assuring those Israelites that He gave them those commandments for their own good? In fact, you read things like, you are to be careful to do all that I've commanded you so that it will go well with you. He says so that you'll go well with your children, you'll live long in the land that the Lord is giving you. Your wine vats will overflow with new wine. Your barns will be filled with plenty. The rain will descend. Your crops will be plentiful at harvest. Your children will multiply and be a blessing before you. Your flocks and your herds will all multiply. I'll protect you. Your enemies will be dealt with. You will have prosperity and blessings. I know people capitalize on that with this health and wealth gospel nowadays. But God literally told them, I'm going to do everything to take good care of you. It's not that you're going to be without hurdles in your life and trials and difficulties. You'll have those, but you'll have trust in God that He'll get you through those. Now, God's not promising anybody you're going to be wealthy. But He is saying that if you want to have a life that is blessed, if you want to have a life that doesn't have the same kinds of cares and problems and troubles that the world has, they bring on themselves because they continue violating God's command, then follow my will. You hear stories all the time from people in the world, and you just listen to the stories and you just almost cringe. And then this is happening to me, and then this is happening to me, and most of their problems are all because they've not been willing to obey God. Half of them could have been solved if they would have just listened to God. And they end up with all kinds of situations as a result. In Deuteronomy chapter 4, let me just read this one to you before we bring this to a close. Deuteronomy chapter 4. Notice what God tells the children of Israel here. Deuteronomy chapter 4, beginning in verse 5. He says, notice how the reaction of the nations around them would be when they're really obeying God. See, I have taught you statutes and judgments, just as the Lord my God commanded me, that you should do thus in the land where you are entering to possess it. So keep and do them. For that is your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the peoples who will hear all these statutes and say, surely this great nation is wise and an understanding people. For what great nation is there that has a God so near to it as is the Lord our God whenever we call on Him? Or what great nation is there that has statutes and judgments as righteous as this whole law, which I am setting before you today? The nations around you are going to look and say, wow, if they're doing this well, we might want to start patterning our nation after their principles and practices. If those people's lives are that good, we need to learn what kind of conduct they are practicing, and we ought to practice that ourselves. And don't you think that's one of the best evangelistic tools you can have? Is a life that is lived for God. Because people around you will say, wow, take a look at that individual. Man, they seem to really trust in God no matter what happens. They just have peace and they have this great joy. How is it that nothing really gets to them? How is it they live such a wonderful, content life in this world? They don't seem to need much. They just trust God. And they will start to wonder How is it that you do that? Well, it's because you have a God that's taking care of you and who you trust and continue to follow His commands. Let me give you one more passage as we close. Isaiah chapter 48. This really expresses God's heart behind His commands, okay? And why we really need to make sure that we are continually observing His commands, meditating on His commands, and doing what they say. Isaiah 48, 17 through 19. He says, "Thus says the Lord, your Redeemer, the Holy One of Israel. I am the Lord your God, who teaches you to profit, who leads you in the way you should go. If only you had paid attention to my commandments, then your well-being would have been like a river, and your righteousness like the waves of the sea. Your descendants would have been like the sand, and your offspring like its grains. Their name would never be cut off or destroyed from my presence." And that word for well-being in verse 18 is peace. Your peace would have been like a river. We sometimes sing about having peace like a river. That's the idea. And so if you want to have a life where you are protected by God, a life where God is the one who's making sure you're blessed, God is the one who's walking with you through the valley of the shadow of death. If you want to have a life that brings you peace, that passes all understanding, and a joy that you just feel no matter what you have to go through, then you need to be somebody who invests seriously in keeping God's commands, studying and learning what He's commanded of you, and letting your time be absolved and immersed in trying to do those things to the best of your ability, that you may be pleasing before Him. He sees when you put forth those extra efforts to do His will, and He will reward those who serve Him. And so hopefully as an introduction to the Ten Commandments, this kind of gets us thinking. We will begin to look at each one of these individually. But maybe this morning you don't have the peace that passes all understanding, or you don't feel confident about having God's protection. You feel guilty, you're sort of doubting, maybe you have fear. If those are some things that you're dealing with, you can shake all that. God promises to forgive those who are penitent. If you're ready to, like Isabel, obey the gospel this morning, or maybe in your case, you just need to return back to God and ask for the prayers of the church. If we can help you in any way, please come forward as we stand and as we sing.
Just as I am, without one plea, but that thy blood was shed for me, and that thou bidst me come to thee, O Lamb. I come, just as in my soul of one dark blood to thee. Just as I am, though tossed up with many a conflict, many a doubt, with fears within and foes without, O Lamb of
come, just as I am, thou wilt receive, will welcome, pardon, cleanse, relieve, because I promise I believe, O Lamb of God, I come, just as I am, thy love unknown has broken every barrier down, now to be thine, yea, thine alone, O Lamb of God, I come, I come. Be seated, please. To prepare our minds for the Lord's Supper, number 139. Number 139, Jesus paid it all. I want to tell you that I don't know that song, so you'll have to wait for Glenn to lead that next time he leads song. We'll sing number 140 in your book, which is right next to 139, so it's not going to be on the screen. Number 140. 140, I'll give you a moment to look that up in your songbook. It's up. It's up, okay. I hear the Savior say, thy strength indeed is small. Child of weakness, watch and pray. Find in thee thy all in all. Jesus paid it all to him I owe. Sin had left a crimson stain, he washed it white as snow. Lord, now indeed I find thy power and thine alone can change the leper's spots and melt the heart of stone. Jesus paid it all to him I owe. Sin had left a crimson stain, he washed it white as snow. And when before the throne I stand in him complete, I'll lay my trophies down, all down at Jesus' feet. Jesus paid it all to him I owe. Sin had left a crimson stain, he washed it white as snow.
Does anybody need the elements of the Lord's Supper this morning? Turn your Bibles over to Philippians, the 2nd chapter. We're going to start reading in verse 5. Philippians, the 2nd chapter, reading, starting in verse 5. It says, have this attitude in yourselves, which was also in Christ Jesus, who, though he existed in the form of God, did not regard equality with God a thing to be grasped. But he emptied himself, taking the form of a bondservant, and being made in the likeness of men, being found in appearance as a man, He humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even the death on the cross. For this reason also God highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name which is above every name, so that the name of Jesus every knee will bow of those who are in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and that every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Let us pray. Our Father in heaven, we're so thankful that we are called your children, that we can give you the honor and glory which you so richly deserve. Father, we partake of this bread to Christians represents our Lord and Savior there hanging on that cross. It represents his body which he gave for us. Father, may we partake of it in a way that is pleasing unto thee, remembering what he has done for us. It's in his name I pray. Amen. We also partake of the cup, which represents the blood of our Savior. Let us pray. Father, as we continue our prayers unto thee this day, we give you the thanks for the blood which was shed from your Son's body. Father, we know that because he loved us, he was willing to go to that cross and die and give that ultimate sacrifice for each and every one of us. Father, let us partake of this fruit of the vine, pleasing unto thee, and remembering the suffering that our Lord and Savior went through. In Christ's name I pray. Amen. Separate from taking of communion that we remember our Lord is that we give back upon the first day of the week. He has blessed us with so much, a wonderful country to live in. We're given far beyond what the world can even imagine. So let us pray and give thanks for God. Our God and Father in heaven, we again approach your throne, giving you the thanks for the bountiful blessings in our life. We know the greatest blessings is given of your Son that came and suffered and died for us. But Father, you give us all the physical needs of this life that we can live a happy life, relying upon you and giving you thanks for what you have given us each day of our lives. And Father, may we never forget where everything we have has come from, and it has come from you. And Lord, we give thanks for that. And it's in our Lord's name we pray. Amen.
Let's stand and we'll sing our closing song is Jesus Loves Me, number 702. Number 702. Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so. Little ones to him belong. They are weak, but he is strong. Yes, Jesus loves me. Yes, Jesus loves me. Yes, Jesus loves me. The Bible tells me so. Jesus loves me, he who died, heaven's gate to open wide. He will wash away my sin. Let his little child come in. Yes, Jesus loves me. Yeah, Jesus loves me. Yes, Jesus loves me. The Bible tells me so. Jesus, take this heart of mine, make it pure and holy thine. On the cross you died for me, I will try to live for thee.
Yes, Jesus loves me. Yes, Jesus loves me. Yes, Jesus loves me. The Bible tells me so.
Shall we pray? Our Heavenly Father, we're truly thankful that we've had this time to sing and glorify your name and worship you. Father, we're truly thankful for our sisters come forward to be baptized. And Father, we rejoice with her as we welcome her into your church. Father, we're truly thankful that your Son came to this earth, died upon a cross for our forgiveness of sin. Be with us now as we go throughout this week, that we might be an example and a light unto others around us. May you watch over and bless us. We ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.